Tech Time Traveler here. So yeah, about that 1974 terminal video. So I ended up ordering two 1K ohm trimmer resistors. I needed to hopefully fix the power supply, but the seller goofed up and put one 100 ohm unit in there, which unfortunately means, yet again, I can't try to power it up. I've ordered a grab bag full of replacements this time from a different supplier, but yeah, it's going to be a little bit of a wait. So moving along from that for now, I decided to tackle some low-hanging fruit on my ever-lengthening to-do list. This Tandy 2500 XL has been awaiting a replacement RTC battery for eons, which I finally got around to ordering a few months ago and decided to install just now. I figured this would be a quick job. Not so fast. Now, I've mentioned in previous videos before, I'm trying not to add too much to my x86 vintage computer collection these days. It takes up a lot of space, and yeah, I have too many machines in that category already, and some may never see much or any use as it is. Plus, although prices for x86 gear aren't by any means outrageous, there's still more than I think one should pay, so I don't really bother unless it's near free. The only exception I make these days is if it's something really rare and unusual, or if it's directly from my childhood. And this Tandy does sort of fit those exceptions. Growing up in the late 80s and early 90s, our family, like the minority of families who actually had a computer, basically shared one main computer upstairs in my dad's office. We did have a Commodore 64 and VIC-20 also. Those had passed to me from my dad and were mine alone, but in the early 90s my interest was shifting to PCs. There were games available there that weren't available for the Commodore 64, and the 64 was kind of old and becoming a dead end by then. Thankfully, my sisters weren't big on computers at all because back then, liking or using computers was like social herpes. So, unless my dad needed to work, I had his computer at my disposal, as long as I promised never to F-disk his files into oblivion again. My dad was a pretty loyal IBM customer. Our first IBM was a PC Junior, and we kind of moved up the chain more or less linearly through to a 5170 AT with miserable 4-color CGA graphics. We also got a Toshiba T5100, which I belatedly realized had 16-color EGA graphics one day, which I could only fully enjoy by borrowing the 5154 monitor from our AT. For a very brief period before the AT, we actually did have VGA at our disposal via an IBM PS2 Model 30, but it was only there briefly and replaced with the AT for reasons unknown to me. I only recall its existence because I remember seeing its 3.5-inch setup discs in my dad's desk drawer for years after. Funny enough, after the Panasonic went away, we went back to a PS2 Model 30 again, and we stuck with it for the duration. I don't remember how I became aware of VGA graphics. This was the pre-internet era, so I probably heard about them through a friend, or maybe caught them in a magazine somewhere or at a computer store. Or possibly just reading enviously in one of those IBM documentation binders which mentioned the various graphics cards available at the time along with their capabilities. Yeah, I knew right away when I heard about it that VGA was where it was at. 256 colors suddenly made 16 seem rather paltry. I remember as a kid being obsessed with the idea of having lifelike pictures on my computer screen that I could look at and manipulate. That was the future, and I wanted in. Let the dad harassment begin. What my dad came up with was kind of like this Tandy 2500 you see here, but kinda not. I mean, it was a Tandy underneath, but we didn't know it. The badge on our new VGA-enabled PC was actually Panasonic. Yep, if you didn't know it before, Tandy didn't just make computers for themselves in the early 90s, they also produced rebadged machines for others. Panasonic, Grid, Digital, even Victor, they all subbed out to Tandy. Apparently, they didn't even bother hiding Tandy's silk screening on their motherboards. Anyway, Dad got us a Panasonic. I think the full name was Panasonic Business Partner, but it was really a Tandy. I wish I could tell you the exact model I think our machine was, but for some reason I can't find any pics of it at all. In fact, I haven't been able to find any that are even for sale. I've been looking for a machine just like the one we had for eons for the collection, but alas, it's a ghost. Although Canada and the US are thought of as different accented sides of the same coin, Canada is a slightly different market from the US, and we often get things Americans don't and vice versa. For example, another machine on my hit list is the Sanyo MBC16. We had a school lab full of these, but in years of searching, I've yet to come across one for sale from Canada or the US. It was difficult even to find advertising for a Tandy/Panasonic computer, and even if you did, typically what you got were drawings like this, not actual pictures. It was only in the last few years that some Panasonic branded Tandys started showing up on eBay. This one, the Business Partner FX1650, looks pretty close to what I remember. Initially when I saw this, I thought I'd found it. I put in a bid, but sadly there's this thing called other collectors, and they bid the crap out of it. Darn it. Why is it there's always someone else into obscure stuff like yourself? But later I was looking at a Tandy 2500 XL like this one, and I realized there were elements of the FX1650 that didn't jive with my recollections of things. The FX1650 is clearly based on the Tandy 1000 TL, so it has Tandy CGA graphics with the 9-pin D-sub on the back, and I don't remember seeing something like that on our machine. I know for a fact the machine we had VGA. I suppose it's possible our Panasonic was upgraded, of course. The problem is it's been 30 years, and really I didn't take too many notes about that computer at that time. It was only with us for a short little while. A couple of years ago I was looking around on eBay and up came another 2500 XL. This machine definitely twigged my brain a bit because for whatever reason I seem to remember our Panasonic being shorter than the TL/FX1650, and this machine was definitely shorter. I also seem to remember ours having this rectangular power button with the LED indicator light in the middle versus the slimmer and rounded one with no LED on the FX1650. One other thing that comes to mind but that I don't recall 100% is the processor. I could have sworn it was a 386SX of some kind, not a 286. But that could be 30 years of memory fog at work. I did have other 386SX machines later on. I might just be confusing things. It happens when you get older. Yeah, to my mind's eye, it would have looked something like this with a rebadged second generation Tandy keyboard. I may never be able to confirm what I had. If it was a Canada or foreign market specific thing, there may not have been very many to begin with, and perhaps few or none survive. My only hope of a photo would be in some magazine or such, and that was if it was advertised. Anyway, there was this guy on eBay dumping tons of 2500 XLs for cheap, so yeah, I grabbed one. At this point, I was about 90% sure that it was similar to the Panasonic Business Partner my dad got us. Basically the same computer, just in disguise. And looking at it now, boy do those memories come flowing back. My dad had our Panasonic delivered to his office, and we went down there on a Saturday to check it out. VGA graphics at last. Unfortunately, my dad didn't go quite all the way. Rather than buying a color monitor, he picked up a monochrome unit instead. Remember the so-called paper white VGA monitors? Yeah, never was able to figure out if that was an actual thing or just a marketing gimmick. Why did my dad go for a monochrome rather than color VGA monitor? It might have been a few things. For one, I kind of remember the monitor being a Panasonic branded monitor as well, so I think it probably just kind of went with the computer. Second, the Business Partner was probably targeted at business users, and yeah, not everybody was using color in business back then. Lastly, there was a substantial cost difference between monochrome and VGA. This was at a time when $100 was actually real money, and yeah, I think my dad probably was persuaded by the cost savings for the moment, given that he was already absorbing almost $2,000 for the computer itself. Honestly, I didn't mind it that much. I would have preferred color, but the paperwhite monochrome unit we got was pretty slick, and you could still see things pretty clearly with VGA-enabled games. Anyway, here's the sat sack we have before us today. The seller who was offering these sold something like 20 of them, one at a time over a span of months. And it was pretty clear they'd been pulled from some sort of institutional setting. They all had network cards and none of them had hard drives. Unfortunately, when I first got this nearly 2 years ago, I didn't have any hard drives for it either. My first foray with it was not very successful at all. The Dallas RTC, remember RTCs, folks? The battery in it was long dead, and the machine seemed to be rather erratic. Usually in a dead CMOS battery situation, I'm good to just enter dates and hardware specs manually when I want to use the machine, and it works. But this one didn't. It refused to accept any entries I put in for the hard drive. I'd enter the particulars, reboot, and nope, back to nothing. It would accept time and floppy parameters, but not that. And then there was something awry with the floppy drive. It just kind of stopped booting or reading from disks altogether. It basically just put up a not ready error, and Tandy would carry on to its own ROM-DOS, booting up into Deskmate. I put the machine away intending to pick up one of those refurb RTCs online. You can take one of these apart, but it's a messy process and the brittle plastic cover breaks pretty easily. I decided to pay for someone else to take on the trouble, but I didn't get around to it for quite a while. Now today, finally, I have. and I'm hoping maybe it'll solve some of the weirdness issues I have with this machine once and for all. I gotta say, I love the Tandy design motif. It just has such a pleasant pizza box square kind of look to it, with unfancy front grille, and then of course a white painted cover with soft plastic on the front. The back bezel here seems to have been kissed by FedEx, but otherwise it's all in pretty decent condition. And as I'm looking at it, yeah, it really does remind me of that long-lost Panasonic. Now you can see a few things are amiss here. We're missing the blue floppy eject button for starters, and the floppy drive inside is disheveled. But don't worry, I do have the button. The floppy was installed correctly when it came to me. When I was doing my initial exploration, the floppy drive began acting strangely, refusing to read disks. I thought the issue might be the disk detection switch, which sits inboard of the write protect detection switch. So I soldered on a piece of wire, and that sort of solved the issue for the moment. But between then and filming this video, I just kind of tossed the floppy drive in there without securing it. We'll do a little 10-cent tour here. The front of the machine is unfussy and lacking the volume knob that was present on earlier Tandy models like the 1000TX and TL. That function is now controlled in BIOS settings. It has a nice big reset button, floppy eject, and power. Simple. The back, we've got the usual array of late 80s, early 90s ports. We have an earphone and mic port, something you typically wouldn't see on a PC equipped with only the basic speaker, and we know why. There's a VGA monitor port, printer port, serial port, keyboard and mouse, and 3 open slots for network cards, sound cards, or what have you. Man, I love the Tandy design. It's just so simple. Anyway, that's enough gawking. Let's open her up. The case is pretty easy to remove, just 2 screws, one on either side, and then you kind of slide it forwards carefully and out. It can be a bit sticky. There's metal rods on the inside of the case that align with the holes in the chassis, and these sometimes bind when you're pulling the case off. Opening it up, we can see the 2500 has a locking metal shield that kind of opens up clam-like. Kind of reminds me of the Mars rover and the way it unpacks itself. It came with a set of keys. That probably would have been handy in a school environment to keep pesky kids from doing anything crazy like, I don't know, installing an unapproved SCSI controller? Or maybe a scanner? Anyway, there's parts of this design I like and don't like. I like that everything is easily accessible. Tandy was always pretty good about that. They didn't treat their customers like unwanted invaders. That said, it is a bit of a process to get everything fully open, and of course some of the screws for devices aren't the easiest to get to. I'll pull the floppy drive out here, and since we'll be testing to see if that wants to work today. Yep, so there's my handiwork. I'm not sure what the practical consequences of the drive always thinking a disk is inserted are, but yeah, anyway. This is one of those annoying Sony 3.5-inch drives, the ones where the power is integrated into the floppy drive cable rather than on a separate 4-pin header. You gotta be careful about that. If you plug a regular drive into the Tandy cable, you may get a smoke show. Go on, ask me how I know. These drives are getting really old, cranky, and replacements are scarce and expensive for what they are. You can, of course, rig up a different drive if you account for the power wires, but then you won't have that nice Tandy blue eject button anymore. Yeah. Inside the machine, we have the suspected culprit for its flakiness, the Dallas RTC. We'll be replacing this today and crossing fingers that this machine starts working properly. Like I said earlier, you can replace the internal battery yourself, but it's not that easy. I just went ahead and bought something from eBay, what I suspect is a rebuilt unit. I've heard mixed reviews about these, so we'll see what happens. Anyway, let's remove the dead unit. I wonder if I can send this somewhere to be rebuilt? And we'll pull out the replacement here. Note the bit of electrical tape at the bottom there. Yeah, I think someone very carefully took this apart and then just replaced that internal dead battery. And I'm good with that. Reduce, reuse, recycle, right? I guess the only problem you could run into potentially is if the chip itself dies. You know, they are 30 plus years old after all. Let's take a brief tour inside here since we have it open. The first thing to note about the 2500 is that although it's superficially similar to the 1000 series that came before it, it is a substantially different machine. This is a true AT class MS-DOS compatible. The entirety of the original Tandy 1000 series, with the exception of the RLX and RSX, were all XT class machines. I regret I haven't been able to find proper parts or service manuals for the 2500 XL online, so some of the Tandy labeled chips are kind of a mystery as to what exactly they do. But some components we can identify pretty easily. For example, the CPU is easily recognizable. This is an AMD 286 running at 10 MHz. Yay, I guess. Over here we have 4 30-pin SIM slots for RAM. Right now the machine has a grand total of 1 megabyte using 4 256 kilobyte chips. One whole meg. Yeah, I believe the max for this system was about 4 megs. We have a custom 40-pin chip down here. I'm not 100% sure what it is, but given its proximity to the BIOS ROM location jumper, I figure it has something to do with BIOS. Note we have 2 empty sockets here, and according to the limited info I could find, the 2500 could run a plain Jane BIOS, or it could run one with DeskMate. I'm assuming if you wanted to forgo DeskMate, you could install some custom EEPROMs here with a more conventional BIOS. This X28168P chip over here appears to be some kind of ROM also. We've got our 24 meg crystal up here, and this appears to be a custom LSI chip. I couldn't really find anything online about what it does. Also, there's a 40-pin IDE connector partially obscured by the floppy cable here. Moving up, we have the chipset provided by a company called Headland. There's also a PL153 programmable logic array chip. Over here on the right are the integrated Paradise PVGA-1A graphics. Nothing terribly fancy here. As we can see by the spec sheet, the only 256 color mode is 320 by 200, so yeah, this is pretty old school VGA. It can do up to 640 by 480 resolution, but apparently only to a max of 16 colors. One thing I was surprised to find out was that while Tandy had retired their famed 16-color CGA Tandy graphics in favor of VGA, they actually carried over the 3-voice sound to the 2500 XL. I'm not sure exactly which chips handle that here, but yeah, that's straight from their own documentation. However, there is a catch. Because this is an AT-class machine, there is a second DMA controller, and unfortunately it sits at the address which was typically occupied by the Tandy sound system. To accommodate this, Tandy moved the sound system to a different address, which is a problem because it means most software that supports Tandy sound can't use it without a modification. So that's kind of a bummer, and it makes you wonder why Tandy included it at all. Okay, so now let's get down to business. I'm going to temporarily close up the chassis here. With the RTC chip replaced, I now want to see if the floppy drive will work or not. Of course, we need that to work if we want to load software. My plan here is to use one of the 15 or so working IDE hard drives I purchased and featured in my Will It Run video a while back, and set up this Tandy with it. I anticipate this will not be a totally smooth process, as this machine was designed to run with fairly small capacity hard drives of I think 100 megabytes or less, but we have some ways of getting around that. For initial testing, I'm going to use a Gateway 24-inch LCD. If things are looking good, I'll drag out the only VGA CRT monitor I still have currently for a more period-correct look. Note, although modern VGA connectors look similar to their vintage counterparts, vintage machines lack certain pins, and that means a modern VGA cable can't be plugged into the machine without adaptation. Fortunately, I have this old extension cable from a KVM, and it doesn't have a pin where we don't want it to be, so it can plug into the computer just fine, and then it plugs into the monitor's cable on the other end without any issue. I regret I don't have an AT-style Tandy or Panasonic keyboard, although I've seen them up for sale from time to time. I'll just use this Microsoft PS2 keyboard for now. Now, off camera, I did try booting off the floppy and noticed it was still doing the disk not ready thing. But then it dawned on me that maybe the BIOS needs to be configured for a 1.44 meg floppy drive first. Perhaps it was defaulting to 720K and needed a 720K boot floppy to work. As it turns out, I found a 720K Tandy 2500 XL boot floppy with the necessary setupxl.exe to configure the BIOS on disk, and that seemed to boot just fine. Now I've got the camera on and we'll see how far we get. So we have the standard message you get when the BIOS has lost power or been reset here, and it looks like the floppy is booting, so yeah, I think we're on a good path. So we'll run the BIOS setup program, setupxl, and we can see that it's complaining about having lost power and it's got incorrect configuration record checksums. Yeah, pretty standard stuff I assume when you replace the RTC or if the battery inside died. The BIOS setup looks pretty similar to PCs of the era, and oh, look at that, a place where you can enter a date and time. Too bad our friends at Fubar didn't think of that, huh? It's mostly familiar stuff to anyone who's messed around in their PC BIOS, minus a graphical user interface. Some Tandy specific bits though are the auto deskmate settings over here. In addition to carrying over Tandy 3-voice sound, they also brought over their onboard DOS and deskmate, so you could boot the computer completely diskless. Of course, to use all of deskmate's features you need the deskmate disk pack, but still, with this feature enabled, the machine can boot in under 3 seconds. Try that with Windows 11. One thing I've long forgotten about is having to configure RAM. In 2023, RAM is just plug and play. As long as you have the right type and size for your system, you literally just snap it in and the computer figures out how much you have. But in 1990, things weren't quite that simple. We have 1 meg of RAM total, but we have to tell the system how much of that is base memory, how much is extended memory, since the PCs of this era had a maximum of 640K conventional RAM. This brings back some not so fond memories of having to configure himem.sys and fighting to get software to recognize and use the RAM that's up above 640K. I had a lot of problems with that with my 486 back in the day. We're so spoiled now. I've just put in some basics for time and date. I'm curious if this machine has a Y2K bug, just in case I need to open a stuck vault door. Yeah, this is the error I remember getting before. Something about invalid config info. I had this problem when I first attempted to install a hard drive. It would let me enter parameters, but as soon as I rebooted, they reverted to nothing and the system complained the configuration was bad. I was hoping fixing the RTC would help with this. One thing it's complaining about is the memory size, and I'm pretty sure I've got 1 meg here, but it just doesn't seem to accept 640K base with 384K extended. So I'll try other options. Yeah, no matter what I try, it complains. It also seems to keep messing with the second and third disk drive options. What's going on here? Maybe it's a RAM problem. If I remember correctly, these aren't the original RAM chips that were in this thing when I got it. I think I borrowed these from a couple of massive RAM expansion cards in my IBM 5162, back when I was trying to figure out originally why it wouldn't let me configure a hard drive. I'll try changing things around here and see if that makes any difference. Maybe bad RAM is throwing everything out of whack. Pretty sure these were the original chips, so let's see what happens if I reinstall. Nope. Okay, what am I doing wrong here? And now the date is glitching? Did I just pop open a bunker door somewhere in Russia? Y2K, is that you? Yeah, something's really gacked here. Okay, let's leave this for a second. I just want to see if this thing will recognize any hard drives now, or if we're just barking up the wrong tree here. So let's grab from the pile of hard drives that tested good in a previous video and see if we can get any traction. No, these aren't quite correct for this machine. From ads, it seems like the 2500 XL typically came with 40 megs or so. So we may still run into trouble getting this thing to recognize anything. So the first one I'm going to try is this 341 meg Caviar 2340. I know that makes no sense because I do have smaller drives, but yeah, I just had a thing for Western Digital today. And once again, the BIOS settings are all messed up. Dang it. So far it's letting me enter the values for the hard drive though, but will it store them? Still that darn configuration error. Let's boot up DOS and see if we can see the hard drive. All of these drives were formatted with stuff on them, so it might work. If the size is too large, it might not though. I've not been able to find out exactly the max that this system can handle. It accepts my custom parameters and BIOS, but maybe that's a ruse. It does seem to max out at 1099 cylinders. Anything more than that, it won't accept. Nope, I can tell right away the C drive I'm looking at is the onboard ROM. These are the very limited contents of that ROM drive. Nope, if I pull the boot disk, it just goes straight into Deskmate. Okay, new drive. Let's try what we should have tried the first time, a smaller drive. This is the smallest one I have, a Seagate 130 meg, which I know tested good in my previous testing. Still getting configuration error, but at least it kept the last hard drive parameters. New parameters entered okay, and now it's complaining about hard drive and IT failure. Awesome. Alright, let's see if a 340 meg Seagate works. Probably not, but you never know. Parameters entered, and reboot. Ah, fdisk sees it. That's new. Alright, let's try creating a new partition and see what happens. Yeah, I can't delete the existing one. That's a problem. While I ponder that, I made a little discovery that might explain why the BIOS keeps resetting parameters. See this jumper? Yep, if this jumper is installed, that's exactly what it's trying to do. Clear the CMOS settings. Duh. With the jumper removed, I should be able to set parameters properly and have it hold them. Let's test that. Well, it's still not accepting the RAM settings I've chosen, but did it at least keep time? Yep, it appears it kept my fake 1994 date, which I put in there because I was afraid that maybe the Y2K thing was a real issue with this machine. Unfortunately, I still can't see the contents of the hard drive, and I'm pretty sure from going back in my video footage that this was one that was definitely formatted with DOS, so I don't know what's going on here. I decided to change track and figure out this bothersome RAM issue. And what I discovered was the only way that it will recognize the extended memory and count it up is if this little shadow RAM box is checked. If that isn't checked, then it doesn't work. I don't remember having to do anything like that before with my other machines, but maybe there's something I've forgotten. I'm not sure why it has an option though if it doesn't work the other way. The BIOS settings are holding, but we're getting an annoying configuration error message. I spend a bunch of time swapping RAM and trying to figure out what the issue is, only to discover it's something I would never suspect, the setting for the mouse port device. It's set to enabled, but I don't have a bus mouse connected. Turning that off? Voila, no more error messages and everything behaves. It would have been nice if the error messages actually mentioned that, but oh well. Alright, with that in hand, let's see if we can get this hard drive situation sorted. There is an old debug method you can use to force the drive to essentially do the same thing as Windows 10's diskpart clean command. This will wipe the drive completely clean, destroy all existing partitions, and basically the machine will treat it like it's a brand new drive. And I'm hoping after doing this, it'll actually let me F-disk and format it. So let's see if I can work here. Yes, I can create a partition. This is way further than I got before. Now let's see if it'll format. And it does. However, I didn't notice at the time when I was filming because I'm not used to seeing things expressed in bytes. It only formatted 32 megs, so I suspect this is a BIOS limitation of sorts. Although the machine came with a 40 meg, maybe it's a DOS 3.3 thing? I'm 99% sure this machine doesn't support 300 meg drives natively, but anyway, this is the first time I've seen this machine even recognize a hard drive at all. So yeah, I'm eager to see if it'll boot. Nope, straight to deskmate. Dang. Interestingly, if I boot off my DOS floppy here, I can see the drive still no problem. So we've definitely got something weird going on, some kind of compatibility issue for sure. Well, I think I should be able to figure this mess out. What I can do is use something I haven't used in over 30 years, a BIOS overlay tool that'll let me get around the potential size limitations. Since I'm feeling confident that I've got the hardware in check here, I think I'll put the chassis and everything back together. Even all these years later, there's still a huge amount of satisfaction doing final assembly of a computer like this. The hard drive only has screws on one side due to the design of the chassis. Same for the floppy, but they're awkwardly right in front of where the rod for the power button is. I have to gently bend the rod up to get under there. The cover is a bit tricky to get back on. You gotta align the floppy drive button and the guide rods correctly. There's a bit of finesse to it. On the back corner here we can see what appear to be asset markings. I think, based on the number and configuration of these machines that appeared on eBay, and just kind of looking at what they've got here, these must have been school units. I'm pretty sure the HS here stands for high school. I decided before I really get into things, I'm going to try copying a larger quantity of files to the hard drive. Obviously I still have to work out the whole BIOS translation thing before it'll boot, but I just want to see if things are working well enough to proceed. And that's when the floppy drive bombed. I took the machine apart again and had a close-up look, and this is what the floppy drive has started doing. Ugh. Yeah, this drive has been flaky since day one. I'm not sure what's going on here, but basically it seems like the drive is trying to force the heads all the way forward and has lost the ability to pull them backwards. Either that or it's really into metal. Now, fortunately, I'm not without options here. I have a Tandy TL that blew up on me, like literally, so it's basically a parts machine. And it had a 3.5-inch drive that still worked. Unfortunately, it's 720K, so I'll have to be loading software using twice as many disks, but whatever. Luckily, I can just change the button to the 1.44 meg one for now, and no one except however many thousands of people are watching this will be the wiser. Thank goodness I have a huge stock of brand new 720K floppy disks. At least I can work efficiently. Yeah, I could rig up something like that old DOS-based parallel cable transfer software, but really in the amount of time it'll take me to remember how to set that up, it's just as easy to copy to a bevy of 720K floppy disks. I'll leave things partially disassembled here just in case we have more problems. Anyway, the first order of business is fixing the issue with BIOS translation. I refreshed myself on 286s and hard drives, and yes, it seems like this Tandy would have an issue with a quote-unquote large hard drive like the 340 meg I have installed. So I'm going to use some software called Ontrack Disk Manager to install a BIOS translator that should allow me the full space available. I regret during this sequence my camera went totally out of focus for some reason, but yeah, hopefully you get the idea. With Ontrack installed, I now have 340 megs at my disposal, and I can now install DOS. And I'm going to choose a somewhat modern DOS rather than the version 3.3 this machine originally came with. Let's go with DOS 5.0. With DOS installed, everything boots perfectly. I forgot to disable the shell that comes with 5.0, but yeah, I'll do that later. Yeah, things are looking up here. I think with this, I feel confident enough to put things back together again and put the cover back on, at last. And since I'd like to keep things authentic, I'm going to switch monitors and fire up my old IBM 8513 VGA monitor. Hardly a performance beast, but at least consistent with the time period. I wish I had a so-called paper white VGA monitor to mimic what we originally had with our Panasonic, but this is the only VGA CRT I have left. Can't believe I threw out a whole bunch of these, including a 9-inch IBM monochrome VGA unit way back in the day. For software, I've chosen a few titles I remember using on our Panasonic. I've chosen Ski or Die, which, while technically not a VGA game, was what was installed on the machine when we got it. I'll also try a few others I seem to recall playing, like Test Drive 3 and Mean Streets. And then I'm going to fire up PC Paintbrush, which was the first utility I'd ever used that allowed me to manipulate a digital photographic quality image. Now, just a quick production note, filming with a CRT can be a real challenge, especially when you don't have an expensive digital camera with a fully adjustable shutter speed. Plus, this 8513 is old and kind of tired, and I think it's running a little bit out of spec. When I adjust the brightness and contrast, the vertical picture size changes. I don't think it's supposed to do that. When it sits for a long time, the image quality on power up is awful. Text is pretty much unreadable. However, give it a half hour or so, or use it regularly like I have been for the past 2 weeks, and things noticeably improve. You can see some color fringing around the text if you look close, but in person it's hard to notice, and it seems to continuously get better. These monitors, while somewhat iconic I guess to us nostalgic collectors, really weren't the best of quality, and some of them suffered from flyback transformer issues early on. Anyway, to film this thing with minimal moire and no flicker, I have to set my camera at 60 frames per second and then move it right up close to the screen. If I'm even an inch too far back, the flicker will be constant. But in close, it does seem to stabilize. You may see initial flickering as the camera tries to lock on. Okay, so first up is the very first game I ever played on a VGA-enabled system, Ski or Die, which came out the same year we got our Panasonic machine in 1990. This was the follow-up to the popular Skate or Die, and honestly, it's one of the most addictive games of the era. Iconic too. I mean, how many games can you recall that featured a punked-out ski freak Rodney Dangerfield? So we'll go to my favorite comp, which was the downhill race, and now I would have seen this in grayscale like so. Although, as I remember it, the paper white VGA monitor we had, which I think may have been Panasonic branded, it was really quite sharp. Wow, I can't believe I landed that jump. Man, even though it's just a video game, it almost feels like a real place to me, like I'm visiting again. And all these computer-generated guys are my old friends. Yeah, these games are so well done, the other characters almost felt like they were actual people. It's been so long since I've forgotten all the keyboard controls, playing this by keyboard was a bit tricky. See, it's all about the timing. I do remember getting yelled at by my dad for the loudness of that guitar wail. Yeah, it's too bad I didn't know about the volume control back then. This seems to play pretty nicely, actually. I kind of remember it running at about this speed, so that's got me wondering maybe we did have a 286, because I would think if it was a 386, it'd run a lot faster and be a lot harder to control. I survived, and I got a time bonus. Not bad considering I haven't played in about 33 years. Ah, snowball fight. Yeah, for the first year I played this game, I had no idea you could change the direction you were facing and fight attackers from all sides. Whoops. That's what happens when you get games box free. Anyway, thank God for Google. Acro aerials. I used to be pretty good at this one. But again, it's all about the key combos and timing, and that's a little bit tricky. And yep, my timing still sucks. That was respectable. Inner tube thrash was great too, although I never figured out the controls here. My strategy was to knock Lester off at the nearest cliff edge or bridge. I think the forks could be used to burst the opponent's tube, while pumps could blow it up, and there were patches and stuff. Yeah, I don't know, this event never had the same appeal to me that the other ones did. It kind of felt slow to me compared to the other events. I think at one point I did actually figure out the key combinations, but I just didn't have the dexterity required to mount an attack and then control the tube at the same time. Alright, and last we have the half pipe. Again, it's all about the timing here and not hitting things, which I'm very good at. Oh, and collecting those weird Rodney Cupid dolls. Well, this has definitely provided a hit of nostalgia. I haven't played this game in eons. Anyway, we're going to move along here, and we're going to fire up what I think is the first bona fide VGA computer game I ever played, Mean Streets. This one came, I think, on a bootleg disc from our computer dealer. No Tandy sound here, but you don't need it. Access Software blew every long-suffering PC speaker user's mind with real sound. Man, why didn't they have this before? Yeah, this game had real atmosphere going on. And look at those low-res VGA graphics. I mean, these were mind-blowing to me in 1990 compared to the old 16-color EGA, and especially the 4-color CGA hell I'd been stuck in for years before that. These early VGA games have an aesthetic that is totally unique to that era. Mean Streets definitely felt, to me, a little more real than past adventure games, and it had some neat elements like the flying car. And fax machines? Yeah, apparently they still have fax machines in 2033. Yeah, that seems right. But probably the best feature is the photorealistic pictures, which is something we didn't really have before. Before VGA, graphic artists sometimes tried to get realistic looking images with creative use of graphics and colors, but now with VGA you could display 256 colors, so you could use real photographic images. This was exciting stuff in 1990. Yeah, these flying sequences are a little bit slow and kinda dull, and in my memory they happened faster on the Panasonic that we had than here, leading me to believe again we were running some kind of faster CPU in that machine, probably a 386 or 386SX. But yeah, check out this scene in Dr. Alinsky's apartment. We have the same resolution, 320 by 200, that we had in CGA and EGA for other adventure games like King's Quest. But because we have 256 colors instead of 4 or 16, the designers were able to create a lot more detail. I really loved these early VGA adventure games' pseudo-reality. It's an aesthetic that went away as graphics resolutions and available colors massively increased, but it's so unique looking. I'm not such a huge fan of Access's chosen user interface. It's a bit clunky, but yeah, it works anyway, I guess. Now, thinking about it, I don't remember if I actually did run Test Drive 3 on our Panasonic. I'm thinking that may have been on my own, later upgraded to 486 desktop. If I did run it on our Panasonic, that would tend to prove that that machine was probably faster than this, because this is awful. Man, this is what passed for a driving game in the early 90s. And it seemed amazing at the time, especially not being locked to a single course. You could like veer off and drive over bridges and explore a little bit. But yeah, we're not going to be doing much exploring here at 10 megahertz. Alright, well, that's enough of that. For our last software demo, I'm going to pull out something that was also pre-installed on our Panasonic, PC Paintbrush. I developed a bit of an obsession with this for a while because for the first time in my life I was able to manipulate somewhat photographic quality images with way more color options than I'd had previously. I haven't looked at PC Paintbrush in over 30 years, I only ever used it on the Panasonic. Later I switched to something called Deluxe Paint. I debated which version it was that we had on our Panasonic. I think it was maybe version 4, that's the one that kind of looks familiar. And yeah, it's the first one I can see that supported 256 colors, so yeah, I think this is it. Definitely doesn't look exactly like what I remember, but it's pretty close. I do remember the color bar at the bottom with the tiny boxes for all those colors available, so yeah, not that it was much good because again, we had the quote-unquote paper white VGA, so I quite literally had 50 shades of gray down below to choose from. And again, I think that monitor may have had a higher resolution than this one does, so that may be kind of why it looks a little bit off to me right now in 2023. I'll show you a couple of example images they packed in with Paintbrush that I played around with back in the day. This one I definitely remembered, this astronaut dude, which again, coming from 16 color EGA, kind of blew my mind. It's one of those things that you can't really relate to people who have never known a universe with less than super VGA or much higher colors and resolution. Here's the first picture I remember actually manipulating a little bit, and just to simulate what it would have looked like to my 14-year-old eyes, I'm going to change it to grayscale. Yep, that's exactly how I saw this rose in 1990. I remember doing something exactly like this, just selecting a portion of it, copying it and pasting it, and just being amazed that I could do that. I know, kind of lame, I was kind of a weird kid, but you know, if you'd never had the ability to do this before, you did find it kind of interesting, and I was always kind of an artsy type, so yeah, just the context of the time. I thought I might try and push the envelope a bit here and see if I could squeeze 640 by 480 resolution out of this setup to see if it'd make PC Paintbrush look more correct. But as I realized after looking at the specs for the onboard Paradise VGA graphics installed in this machine, it can't handle 640 by 480 with a full 256 colors. Yeah, it kind of worked at 640 by 400 for some reason, but really flickery. Oh well. Now, before we wrap up here, I just want to demonstrate that classic 3-voice Tandy sound that I told you this machine is capable of. I'm just going to be demonstrating the classic Tandy 3-voice sound here. The 2500, like the 1000 TL, received an upgraded digital to analog converter and was capable of far more advanced sound. I demonstrated this on my 1000 TL in a previous video, but I haven't been able to make it work on the 2500. I suspect because the few software titles that supported enhanced Tandy sound aren't patched to deal with the new location of the hardware. If you want to hear it, do check out that video which covered that feature. As I mentioned earlier, Tandy did not abandon Tandy sound when they built these more generic AT-class machines, but they did have to change the address it was located at due to conflicts or potential conflicts with the AT's second DMA controller. This issue affected all of the 2500 series as well as the Tandy RLX and RSX if I recall correctly. This is something you can get around though if you're talented enough, which I'm not, but thankfully other people are. Basically, you just have to patch the software in a way that it redirects calls to the Tandy sound hardware at its old address to the new location that this hardware is at. I think with some software you have to go even further because the software looks for the full Tandy package, graphics and sound, and if it doesn't see the graphics there, then the sound won't work either. Finally, you also typically need a special terminate and stay resident program made by someone called Scully, which is called sndtsr.exe, which handles the actual redirection. Without that, the software may just freeze on loading. Anyway, with a patched version of Sierra's The Black Cauldron, here we go with Tandy sound. Pretty neat, eh? It kind of kills me that I didn't know we had that option on our Panasonic. I suffered along with the old PC beeper for the longest time with that machine. I don't think Panasonic made any specific modifications to the original Tandy motherboard, and I don't think they took the sound chip out. In my defense, we didn't have the internet back then, so there was no way for my 14-year-old self to look this up. A very helpful VC-Fed forum member was kind enough to provide me with both the TSR program and a couple of patched examples of some software, which was really appreciated. Be careful if you have a Tandy 1000 RSX, RLX, or a 2500 series machine like this and want to try this yourself. There is another sndtsr.exe file out there floating around on the internet, and it apparently isn't the same thing. Apparently, hardware vendor SIS bundled it with some of their own sound drivers. It's a different file size and it does not work for our purposes. Okay, here's Ski or Die patched the same way. Not bad, huh? Kinda makes you feel like you're playing it on a Sega or something instead of a PC. I am a little more fond of the PC speaker version. For this game, the attempted guitar wail just strikes a nostalgic chord for me, but you know, this is cool too. Wow, apparently the 3-voice Tandy sound has some magical quality that makes my gameplay not suck. Definitely doesn't seem to be helping here though. Anyway, that's about all for this video, which I thought was going to be just kind of a quick knocking off of something on my to-do list, but turned into a bit more of an adventure. I'll be back though with that terminal video eventually, I promise. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you like what you've seen here, feel free to click the like button. If you don't, well, I do have those special prizes for those who click the dislike. If you really like the channel, please do consider subscribing or even joining our Patreon. It helps improve the channel, maintain equipment, and so on. And again, thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.